well, thank you, Sangeetha and Brendan, for the introduction and welcome. So I'm Sarah Bell. I'm City of Melbourne Chair in Urban Resilience and Innovation here in the Melbourne Sustainable Society Institute, and I am an Associate Researcher with the Life Course Centre. It's my great pleasure to, first of all, meet and now introduce Ruth Fincher. Ruth is the Redmond Barry Distinguished Professor Emeritus here at the University of Melbourne. She's a board member of the International Social Science Council and a past Vice President of the International Geographical Union. And we are, I think, very lucky to have Ruth here to give us our initial keynote kickoff. She has very deep background as a distinguished scholar in urban research, urban planning, urban geography, particularly on the outcomes of immigration, multiculturalism, diversity and difference in cities, including gender issues and issues of inequality and locational disadvantage. You can read more about some of her very distinguished publishing record in the bio that's part of the agenda. And I think it's also important to point out that, as well as her scholarly contribution, Ruth has made has a very strong track record and has made really great contributions to academic leadership, including as a past dean of this faculty in architecture, built environment and planning, and in leading the foundation of our own institute here at the University of Melbourne. And again, there's plenty more of those very worthy achievements listed on the in the agenda. So I think without further ado, I'll hand over to Ruth.
Okay, so thank you very much, Sarah, for those kind introductory comments, and I certainly join Sangeetha and Brendan with you in your acknowledgement of country and our location here on the lands of the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation. Now that a place stream has been added to the structure of the Life Course Centre, there's the interesting opportunity to look quite specifically at some of the major spatial concepts of our science, such as place, space, location, mobility, accessibility. How might they extend our interpretations of disadvantage and life course, those seminal concepts of the centre, and the analyses we make? And I've worked in this sort of intellectual terrain for my whole academic career, which is now ended. And I've partnered with a number of social scientists from different disciplines along the way, as well as other geographers and urban planners. So I thought that what I would do in this talk is really to provide some reflections on the three conceptual pillars that I understand are of interest to many of you: place, disadvantage and life course. And intellectually, my perspective comes from critical geography, from critical social geography. So really, this is a talk about what we mean by certain ideas, with a few brief examples thrown in. I'm not assuming that intervention in government policy and practice is the sole aim of the work we do on these topics. Rather, I think collaborative work with community movements and different segments of civil society, and indeed work that tries to devise the best knowledge frameworks for us is really important too. Let's see if I can do this quicker. Try again. Likes that picture. Here we are. Oops, went twice. Okay. So as I start, I just want to note that critical geography, which is where my comments are coming from, has at its core a concern to be highly aware of the concepts and theoretical frameworks through which we organise our thinking and our research designs. So this means keeping up to date with new conceptualisations as well as with new evidence. And I think critical geography also is concerned to develop the best possible correspondence between our understanding of what the world is, which we might call ontology, and our development of knowledge and evidence about the world, our knowledge base, which we would call epistemology. So a comment on complexity, which Sangeetha has already mentioned. If we know that people's lives are complex and that the causes of their circumstances are complex too, then the knowledge frameworks that we devise that present these lives and the processes underpinning them, they need to be able to account for that complexity of the lives as well. I think that this fascination with research design that draws deeply on how the world is and in all its complex forms comes to critical geography from its roots in the very grounded notions of place, location and space. When we're analysing people's places, how they form them and inhabit them, which aspects of their placed lives are full of opportunities or are demeaning or are highly limiting, we have no choice but to look deeply into those daily lives and activities, and our scientific practice will be steeped in that groundedness.
Something's happening.
There we are. Takes a few presses to get there. I think it's an important understanding of the kind of work we do from the perspective I come from anyway, to see that being is in fact being there. So all place-based work really has this fundamental understanding at its core. If we think of being as including well-being or lack of well-being in populations or neighbourhoods or communities, then it's always important, I think, to add that word there onto the word being, that actually what we're talking about here is not just being in isolation, it's actually being there. Of course, there's always the need to present the complexities that we discover in our research in a manner that can be readily communicated to a range of audiences, including governments for their use. And health researchers, I always think, are really expert at this research translation task. The skill to devise ways to communicate scientific knowledge to different audiences so that it can be acted upon to best effect is really greatly needed and an important part of any research team. And it always brings up for us that dilemma of how do we present the complexities of our understandings, of our knowledge, the knowledge that we've developed of the world in a way that it can be understood for particular audiences. I've been interested to see, as an example of the things I've been talking about so far, to see in this recent UNDP Human Development Report in 2020, its efforts to really embrace the changing information we have about the Anthropocene and to try and include that into our knowledge of human development and well-being. This particular recent report is introduced with great enthusiasm by the eminent economist Amartya Sen. You'll all be very familiar with how these annual reports from UNDP have designed rankings of national well-being for many years based on measures of inequality that tell us different things from the variables that are usually that are used in common GDP measures. So this current report, which is called The Next Frontier, Human Development in the Anthropocene, starts off from the finding that countries with high ecological threats also are likely to evince greater social vulnerability. And the report warns that the COVID pandemic indicates that this situation is going to continue. So the report then goes about amending its past metrics according to this reframing of human development to consider the oneness of social and planetary well-being. It actually adjusts its standard human development index to take account of planetary pressures, including in the revised index, each country's carbon emissions and footprint from use of materials. So it's really moving with the times to consider how human development is progressing or not amongst the world's nations in this epoch of the Anthropocene. Many years ago, I edited a book with the wonderful Professor Peter Saunders from the UNSW Social Policy Research Centre, which was called Creating Unequal Futures. And we wrote an introduction called The Complex Context of Australian Inequality. Now, 20 years ago when we did this, we weren't discussing the dimensions of the Anthropocene as our landmark situation in social policy, unfortunately. But we were in this edited book of contributions by a wide range of social scientists, examining the social context in which poverty, disadvantage and inequality were occurring. And we said that the book aimed to give, and I quote, emphasis to the complexities and multidimensionality of the issues. Furthermore, the processes that give rise to inequality and perpetuate poverty vary. The operation of cause and process, we said, must be specified at a scale where intervention seems possible and sensible if strategies are to emerge, unquote. So you can see in that quote our interest in introducing scale as a really important feature of thinking about the causes of poverty and disadvantage, as we did in that book. Also, the processes giving rise to them, we were interested to show really varied in their extent, and that there may be different local expressions of broader problems or situations. So I want to move after that introduction to the first of the three concepts on which I want to focus, which is the concept of place. And I draw in this section of my talk on a paper I wrote a few years ago, which I understand has just been put in the discussion paper series of the Life Course Centre, although I couldn't find it, but I think it is there. So in academic writings then, and here I draw on the geographic theorist Noel Castry, citing another one of them, John Agnew from 1987, they are presenting the three generally understood meanings of place in geographic social science. First, place can be seen as a location on the Earth's surface. Now, this really old-fashioned way of place thinking, nevertheless, has given rise to many analyses that describe differences and similarities between locations. And really it has, I think, remains really the general understanding of place, especially in policy. Second, place can be a sense that one has about one's own identity in a location or a landscape when one feels in place or out of place, an insider or an outsider. Thus, place can mean a sense of place. And third, place can mean a locale, understood, as Castry says, as a setting and scale for people's daily actions and interactions. So this last idea of place suggests that places are in fact assemblages of contexts for people's activities, and these contexts will have institutional, economic and environmental features, as well as being influenced by things like the histories of that place and the intentions and interests of its dwellers. The first understanding of place on this slide is the one, as I've said, most commonly used in public policy with spatial aims, certainly in Australia. And the third interpretation of place here is the one I think most aligned with contemporary theoretical ideas of what place is and how it's formed. But it's not much yet used in public policy thinking as far as I'm aware, certainly not at the national scale. It is a bit used in socially focused urban planning, as I'll note, and I suspect, and many of you will know more than I do about this, that you could see it as present in some of the thinking in the implementation of the NDIS. So Ilan, you'll know about that more than I do. Okay, so take one on policy use of the term place. Public policy in Australia in general has viewed places as territorial containers of populations, infrastructures or problems, as locations, as I've said, of different kinds, where those locations differ one from the other. And the thinking goes that some forms of government spending might be more efficient if they're focused on certain locations or places. In Australia, influential place as container statements about the importance of place for social well-being and as underpinning social disadvantage have come from repeated editions of the report by the sociologist Tony Vincent entitled Dropping Off the Edge. And this analysis demonstrates, using population data, that disadvantaged individuals are disproportionately located in certain postcode areas. So places in this work are at the scale of the postcode. And mapping is undertaken of the highest to lowest ranked postcode localities. So you have a presentation of localities where those with the highest, middle and lowest rankings on the presence of so-called disadvantaged individuals are shown to us visually. The measures of disadvantage are made according to 22 selected indicators relating to health, education, social distress and criminal behaviour. These population features are claimed in these reports, in the most recent one anyway, to play a significant role in constituting web-like localised systems of disadvantage. So that's what's read into this presentation of these data. Now, I want to note that this kind of thinking can sometimes be a bit blame the victim-ish, and it can and has existed in government programs that have removed lower income people from locations with high concentrations of poverty and disadvantage, often with the justification of desegregating them, I think. The desirability of creating social mix in housing is, as you'll know, a powerful idea in contemporary public housing policy in Australia and elsewhere. That is, it's an idea that is popular when it's applied to poorer people, concentrations of poorer people. We don't do this with richer people. I was hearing a few days ago an interesting little discussion on the radio about the ghetto policy in Denmark, which is an example of this sort of thinking, which has been there since 2010, in which there is really enforced social mix in the housing and of the urban populations there, based on the ethnicity of immigrants. So is enforced assimilation, as it's termed, is in policy results in people being forced to move out of places where it's deemed they are too concentrated, there's too many people living there of the same ethnicity. Now, there are many critics of this kind of thinking who argue from a range of points of view. Some say that conceptually a bunch of variables in a small area like a postcode doesn't make a community or a place. One can also argue, I think, that to explain the spatial distribution of disadvantage in the population, that rather than focusing on the characteristics of the people who live there themselves, one might recognise the important role of economic and infrastructural context and policy interventions in that area. It's past economic history, for example. Places are, furthermore, I really want to emphasise, not containers of people who remain within them. Rather, their boundaries are porous, and people cross these boundaries to move between locations daily or over long time periods. So mobility disrupts many governmental ideas of places as efficient and fixed containers of people. We see this in examples around the world. So one is that governmental attempts are being made in Israel, for example, to corral the nomadic indigenous Bedouin people into town-like settlements. And these increasingly energetic attempts are documented by the Israeli geographer Oren Yiftahel. And this is a not very wonderful photo I took in Israel of a Bedouin settlement by the side of the road, which you can't really see, but the little timber structures are very frail, and on the Judean highway, Ilan. So with the government policy of trying to force Bedouin peoples into settlements, into towns, these kinds of little settlements that are there are very regularly eliminated. In Inner Mongolia, as another example, my colleague, the economic geographer Michael Weber, has studied the effects of the Chinese government in recent decades to persuade the indigenous herder population to settle down into fixed villages via resettlement programs. Oh, there we are. Sorry, I did get it. Oh, hopeless at this. Oh, back again. There we are. Okay, so here's a slide of Michael's in which you can see the kinds of new buildings being put up on the steppes there in Inner Mongolia to house the herder, the nomadic herder peoples there. And indeed, we see in our own country the interest of governmental service providers to reduce the number and spatial spread of remote Indigenous communities. So in these cases from around the world, the view of their place held by local populations is at a broader scale than governments would often like it to be. On to the second way of thinking about place in policy. So places at the scale of localities, neighbourhoods and regions can be locationally advantaged or locationally disadvantaged because of the infrastructure they have that offers physically and socially accessible opportunities to their residents, or doesn't. This way of thinking about places focuses directly on the infrastructural content rather than the residents' characteristics, like the previous take on thinking about place was doing. And over past decades, this idea has been used by urban planners and urban geographers to do things like designate certain locations as food deserts if they lack accessible shops selling affordable and nutritious food, or designating areas as sites of transport poverty if they lack transport facilities to make their populations sufficiently mobile. And from time to time, we see programs of collaboration between Commonwealth and state policymakers to direct programs of infrastructure works to locations in need. Of course, the question of which scale one chooses at which to identify the distribution of advantage and disadvantage and what the policy responses are required to change distributions of that scale is a crucial matter. So rather than looking at postcodes or neighbourhoods and local areas, some analysts over the years have taken much larger levels of spatial aggregation, metropolitan city regions, large towns, small towns and their associated regions, rural towns and regions. I think here of the work of Scott Baum, Bob Stimpson, Kevin O'Connor, these kinds of geographers. And clearly the policy interventions needed will have to be designed at a level to accommodate those scales. I want to say that in any attempt to link place to reducing disadvantage, the distribution of enabling infrastructure to facilitate interaction or mobility between people from a range of places will be significant, rather than a focus solely on what happens within places from the allocation of resources there. So as I've noted, a third approach to place is that place can mean a locale understood as we saw as a setting and scale for people's daily actions and interactions. This idea isn't represented strongly in national policy thinking, but as I've said in urban planning, and as Brendan says in urban design on a good day, the practice of placemaking recognises that places are produced by residents working with institutional players and other so-called stakeholders who may be from outside the locality. The power relations that prevail, however, when certain institutions or organisations desire to impose meanings of place top-down in these situations of implementing placemaking practices can often be an issue and a source of conflict. So I want to emphasise that it's the activities and practices together of place dwellers and others associated with the place that produce that place, rather than just the actions of individuals there or indeed households alone. So I think the urban studies literature about encounter is a useful model for our discussion of place. So in that literature, ongoing encounters or interactions between people are what actually make up the city's society, and also what actually make up the environmental and social context on which those people draw. Encounters, especially across difference, are seen as fundamental ontologically to the ongoing making of the social relations of the city. So perhaps we could say about place what has been said about care, that it is not, quote, located in individual identities. It is produced intersubjectively in relation and through practice, unquote. And I'm quoting Parvati Raghuram there. So far from merely considering people as individuals or households acting in isolation from each other in the areas in which they live, this perspective puts the act of social interaction in people's lives as central to their agency and their habitual practice. So it's almost as if the unit of analysis in this way of thinking is the interaction or the encounter, rather than the individual action or the action of a household in a situation. Within these encounters that create place, of course, as I've said, are power relations. So discussing any particular place, we always need to ask, whose place is this and for whom is it a place? And how do they constitute it as a place through their interactions? And around this, there'll often be different views. In Swanston Street in central Melbourne, between the University of Melbourne and RMIT University, these apartment buildings were built by private developers over the last 15 years. They are intended for students from overseas and consist of tiny, tiny apartments and no communal living areas. Students applying from overseas are directed to these establishments by university housing officers. The result is that the place, created institutionally, features a high concentration of international students. So it's made up of young people whose friendships, that really important social matter in young people's lives, the making of friendships, occurs largely between students from their own country or students from a couple of other countries, rather than with young people of the broader Australian community. I remember a particularly poignant interview with a young Chinese student living there a few years ago who said to me that he wasn't interested in spending his time with other Chinese students, as the housing arrangements seemed to presume that he would. He was interested in Western classical music, and he wished to make a social place for himself with those of similar interests. It was really hard for him to find a way to do that, placed as he was in these apartments. He felt actively disadvantaged by his housing circumstances and the separation or even segregation that he felt he was being placed within. Okay, I move then to my second major concept, that of disadvantage. And I want to proceed in this little section of the talk by noting the meaning of the term disadvantage as I use it, and comparing it to the meaning of the terms poverty and inequality. You'll know this terrain well, many of you. I want to also note that the distinctions I'm going to draw are not set in stone. There's slippage between the uses of these three terms, and there's contest over their meaning and use. So the term poverty in Australian social science tends to be associated with the research tradition expressed in the work of Ronald Henderson and his colleagues on the post-World War II Commission of Inquiry into Poverty, that wonderful social scientific investigation. This was published in 1975, but begun many, many years before. This tradition stresses the measurement of income amongst households and individuals against a poverty line. Detailed descriptions are given of incomes and the factors statistically associated with variations in income relative to need. And the thinking about cause here is a listing of factors such as family type, age or labour force status, and how these are associated with the risk of poverty. There's less interest in seeing how the list of factors through which you might explain poverty and its existence might be the outcome of a broader set of generative processes. That having been said, the Henderson inquiry produced reports about poverty from a very broad range of social questions. And in a book I co-edited with the economist John Nivenhazen many years ago, marking a couple of decades since Henderson's final report and trying to see how things had changed since then, if they had, we were certainly able to look across a very, very wide range of social and economic features of Australian society to consider poverty within them. And I remember, Brendan, you writing a landmark chapter on poverty and disability for that volume. I note as well that the term poverty is often thrust into research discourses that don't focus on complex statistical description. So, for example, there's an ambitious current project in the US being led by geographers Victoria Lawson and Sarah Elwood at the University of Washington, who've established a very collaborative international, what they call relational poverty network, in order to develop contemporary knowledge about who is poor, noting the complex relationship of that question to race, gender and other social dimensions as well as class. So they're really concerned with what being poor means conceptually as well as politically, and ways that alliances can be formed between activists, policymakers and researchers to combat poverty in different contexts and places, but also to disrupt some of the interpretations made of that term. And certainly very diverse voices are being represented in that program of work. Use of the term inequality often characterises research in the same general territory as research on poverty. It just doesn't focus exclusively on the poor. Trends in monetary income in different economic groups are measured and compared, and often changes in nations' incomes or wealth or consumption among different segments of the population, often, as you'll know, quartiles of the population, are compared and evaluated against other trends, for example, trends in household structure or economic performance or housing markets. And the rich will generally be observed to be becoming richer in our times, and the poor poorer, or at least not less poor, a situation of increasing inequality. Now, of course, a range of other quality of life features can sit alongside the monetary income received and might offset or worsen the inequality resulting from differences in monetary income. So things like receipt of non-wage employment benefits or use of public services or handouts from your family. So if you think back to my comment about locational advantage, one can imagine that being located in a particularly well-served, well-serviced place might offset income poverty and thus reduce otherwise apparent inequality in some ways for residents there. You can certainly see the point that monetary income levels can't capture all aspects of what a poor life or a rich life might be. The World Social Science Report of 2016, called Challenging Inequalities, Pathways to a Just World, called for a revitalised research agenda on inequalities within and between countries, noting particularly the active intersection of inequalities, such that enduring one form of suffering can make it likely that a country or group within it are prone to other forms of suffering. So think about the pairing of low income and poor health, or poverty and poor environmental conditions. And membership of different identity groups can also be associated with inequalities. So membership of a range of groups can really exacerbate inequalities. Think of, and that's a term we often use in social science now, called intersectionality, that notion of belonging to a range of identity groups. So imagine belonging to certain gender and age identity groups, or certain religious and ethnic identity groups together. That might increase the chances of those groups experiencing inequality, although, as we know, of course, that varies with times and places. Long-standing forms of inequality exist, says Naila Kabir in Chapter 8 of this report, when economic deprivation is co-located with identity-based discrimination and spatial disadvantage. In the report, there's also some discussion of forms of justice, of equalities, what these might be and how they relate to different forms of inequality. We're reminded that around the world are examples of projects and initiatives that transcend some forms of inequality, creating equality, and that we must chronicle these for our reference, creating knowledge about equalities as well as about inequalities. The concept of disadvantage, then, the third one I get to here, a subheading and a heading of disadvantage, analyses the circumstances of people or communities or places with reference to those who are experiencing advantage. So the advantaging and disadvantaging going on is seen both as a set of processes that are generating these outcomes and as the outcomes themselves. Being disadvantaged is a relative state to be in. And this term, like inequality as well, has a strong moral aspect, in that to be disadvantaged is to be unfairly treated relative to others. Locations can be viewed as locationally disadvantaged, as I've noted, compared to other places. To me, research using disadvantage as a guiding concept often pays considerable attention, as I've actually mentioned already, to disadvantaging processes, to what it is that is generating the production and reproduction of the kinds of harm that we are seeing done to certain people in places. The type of knowledge being produced is particularly associated with interrelated causes or assemblages of processes out of which disadvantage is generated. The scale of the processes varies, and some are of global scale and some locally particular, but I think we now know enough not to separate out the global and the local entirely, because global processes always play out locally in particular ways, and the two scales of analysis are not separate in lived reality. I recently read an account of an activist movement in a long-standing low-income community in Baltimore, now principally occupied by Latino immigrants. This is authored by Hernandez and forthcoming in the journal City. The residents of this area are being disadvantaged by the gentrification of their neighbourhood, and they've set up a program of resistance where their strategy is to name and shame incoming gentrifiers and investors whose actions, as they see it, are destroying their neighbourhood and community. And they're hoping through this naming and shaming activism to dissuade those people intending to come into their area. Even in such a small area and a recent activist program, I think you can see that there are processes at numerous scales jostling around, generating this disadvantaging situation, ranging from international migration to a local and valued history and sense of place of this in a long-standing low-income neighbourhood, to a set of outsider investors and gentrifiers from a wide range of other locations, to whom, of course, this is an advantaging situation. So the focus on research on disadvantage, then, I want to argue, is commonly on a wide range of harms experienced as disadvantage rather than solely on low monetary income. So we're including here discrimination on the basis of race, ethnicity, sexuality, ability, age. And then we often also focus in these analyses on specific features and particular processes of the context in which such harms are generated. And indeed, this is similar to what the World Social Science Report called for about a new agenda for examining inequality. So you can see the slippage between the terms. I want to say that one cannot overemphasise the importance of mobility between places as something that can carry people in and out of disadvantage across their lives. The movement of certain population groups to places, usually cities and towns, or away from them, often from smaller regional towns, can create situations of increased disadvantage in the destinations. So think of small towns where housing is cheap, those services are very few. And the attraction to this housing of poor pensioners who then cluster in that location. This certainly happens in Australia. Think of towns offering seasonal tourist-related employment, attracting would-be workers who then struggle to find affordable accommodation for themselves and whose frantic shift work causes them difficulties in caring for their children. Think of the movement of FIFO workers to mining locations and the effects of their new presence on the townspeople who were there before. The relationship between the variety and kinds of mobility and locational disadvantage in destinations, and indeed in some origins of travel, is important. So under the heading of disadvantage, I've roamed around the concepts of poverty, inequality and disadvantage itself by way of concepts of mobility, scale, difference and intersectionality. And I just want to note, as I come to the end of this little bit of the talk, two new directions which I think discussion about the idea of disadvantage, the concept of disadvantage might be taking up. The first is the flip, as I've already mentioned, to some kinds of study of equality, with the intention of documenting the coexistence of equalising and unequalising processes, if you will, of disadvantaging and advantaging processes, and what we can see there. Indeed, I had my own recent and last book called Everyday Equalities, which I wrote with Kurt Iveson, Helga Leitner and Valerie Preston, is an attempt to delve into the production of equalities in daily life in cities. Some analysts see the search for equalities as Pollyanna-ish and feel that we should be solely focusing on the overarching equalities that straddle our world, as indeed they do. But others see it as important to document success and resilience if it occurs even within a broader context of increasing inequality. And the second direction in which I think research around disadvantage might be heading a bit is through discussions of the concept of care, which we might define as the proactive interest of a person or institution in the well-being of another. And here in the work of geography colleagues, here I'm thinking of colleagues like Emma Power and Kathy Nee in Australia, many of them interested in housing, we are seeing the presentation of housing, housing markets, housing policies, forms and materialities of housing defined as infrastructures of care, which of course can generate greater advantage and equality or greater disadvantage and inequality, depending on the level and form of care delivered. So care is a guiding principle and practice of welfare of urban governance, planning and markets. And I think especially the principle of caring with rather than caring for can really underpin aspirations for the just city. On to my final and quite brief discussion of life course, because you're all such experts on this already. It's really widely recognised in social science that longitudinal studies of people's and groups' lives are highly informative and may provide insights different from snapshot studies of those lives at a point in time. What longitudinal studies show, of course, is how lives can change. And of course, as Brendan has already mentioned, the concept of the life course is what allows us to know that such change is not entirely and inevitably biologically driven, as the idea of the life cycle tends to suggest. Rather, life course is the product, and I think I've got it, of a passage through life, through certain stages in life, which are imprecisely demarcated in time, as we see on the slide, but to which our societies give certain interpretations and opportunities and meanings and opportunities. So as Brendan has said to us at the beginning, it's a socially constructed idea of stages of life. Life course approaches in place-aware disciplines like geography, of course, take the view that lived experiences are influenced strongly by people's presence in certain locations, environments, places or spaces. And the times in which one lives are also of the essence. You can imagine living during a war, a financial crisis, indeed during a pandemic. In my own discipline of geography, I have to say that approaches to the study of the life course have rarely looked at whole lives, either through the collection of longitudinal data or the writing of biographies or life histories. And indeed, the discipline of geography is rarely mentioned as a major contributor when one sees reviews of this sort of work. There's some quite early geographic work early in my time frame. So, for example, in the 1970s, ideas of a phenomenological geography of the life world were developed, phenomenology of the life world. And that work revealed that memory, particularly in older people, links lives over lifetimes to places. I'm thinking of the work of David Seaman and Graham Rolls here. So here is introduced the life courses of people and the notion of people's lives as being somehow coherent when one conceptualises their placement in time and space. But for the most part, geographers and urban planning and policy researchers have focused on certain stages of life and what happens in those, with really a lot of concern over how this might be disadvantaging. And certain segments of lives, such as childhood, adolescence, retirement, are singled out for analysis of their particular situatedness in a place, time. And feminist geographers are often the ones pursuing these sorts of questions. So in geographic research, I just mentioned 3 areas of study that have taken up this focus and made quite a contribution. The first is that of the body of work on women's adulthoods of caring and how they fit their caring along with their paid work. And this has been a very long-standing inquiry in a whole range of social science areas as well as geography. But within geography, this has been a profoundly important kind of work in shedding light on the spatialities of this stage of the life course and the mobilities that are required to make do through it with the various tasks it requires. The work, I think, has also revealed variations in the allocations of caring tasks between families in different times and places. And of course, there is important recent work on older age in women particularly, which has drawn our attention to the housing market and its influence on wellbeing. Again, Emma Powell's work is significant in this. There's also a range of queer geographies developing, which are portraying lives and interactions in particular kinds of housing and suburbs, including in Australian cities. The second area I just flagged very briefly for your information is the area that's been termed by human geographers like Sarah Holloway and Jill Valentine, the new social studies of childhood. And that work is revealing how children actively negotiate the spaces of their lives in their different contexts. So there's research about children playing in the streets, in homes, children in schools, and what the limits and possibilities are that they negotiate daily. A lot of this work is showcased in the journal Children's Geographies. And the third contribution to human geography and its view of the life course is the identification of institutional assumptions about life course stages that are then able to be challenged if necessary. Over many years, many of you will be familiar with the work of the amazing feminist philosopher Nancy Fraser, who, along with many others, has revealed the assumptions and judgments about women's lives in particular that are embedded in national social welfare policies. These assumptions guide the policies and institutional practices of governments, firms, and many other organisations. I've often looked back myself in my own work to the path-breaking book in the 1970s of the urban anthropologist Constance Perrin, who wrote a book called Everything in Its Place, Social Order and Land Use in America. Amazing book. And she interviewed a whole lot of urban planners and real estate agents and developers and really categorised their views of the suburbs and the inner cities of America as to how they were appropriate for people at particular life stages. So these city building professionals have then gone out and created housing and community services in urban locations according to such views. One certainly sees similar assumptions about gender and life course stage at work in the marketing and building of luxury inner city high-rise apartments in major Western cities to this day. Look all around you here. So think of the marketing of apartments to downsizing empty nesters and the appropriateness of apartment buildings for families with children, the inappropriateness rather of apartment buildings for families with children that you often see as part of a real estate agent's pitch. So on this slide, you'll see a billboard advertising a Melbourne apartment complex to a lively young woman, presumably an appropriate tenant there. In urban geography, there's also been quite a lot of work that's examined the creation of residential settings exclusively for older residents and other forms of gated communities, and have looked at really the ethics as well as the realities of building in that way to separate people in different life course groups. So in conclusion, what are the points of intersection of these three conceptual pillars that I've talked about today: place, disadvantage, and life course? What place does for disadvantage and life course is to ground them, to force us to see if the conceptual understandings we have about how disadvantage is generated and lived across lives are true to the circumstances of being there, somewhere, situated in time and space. The idea of place, which causes us to examine the spatial nature of all phenomena, gives to the concept of disadvantage the reality that being less well off than others occurs in a setting, a time and a location, and by virtue of that context. To life course, the idea of place makes the point of groundedness in context as well, that the experience of life stages about which we might generalise in their links to disadvantage can also be quite particular to certain groups and their locations, and therefore that the homogeneity of those life course stages cannot be assumed. What disadvantage does for place and life course is to give them a moral setting and to ask them if the arrangements being observed, the arrangements we are documenting in our work, are just. Thinking about terms associated with disadvantage, things like poverty, inequality, equality, forces us to ask how it is that harm is caused to some and not to others in certain settings. These terms can prompt us then to work out together in care, we hope, with the people in the places, ways of ameliorating those harms that we identify as disadvantaging. So these kinds of discussions coming from that idea of disadvantage are the moral heart of our endeavours. And finally, what does life course do for disadvantage and place? What it does is to complicate our understandings of lives lived in particular settings where opportunities for everybody may not be rosy. and to emphasise the potential in lives for both sameness and change, for the possibilities that people's lives will shift and weave, and that being at a certain point at one life course stage doesn't necessarily mean you'll be there at another. These are really important questions for us to consider, and they ask us whether we're viewing lives as too predictable, too homogeneous and predetermined. I think there's long been study of what happens in lives when children are disadvantaged and how much that disadvantage lasts. In addition, being aware of the significance of place in lives doesn't mean that place is a container of lives, a determining feature, or even that its relationship to lives is invariant over different stages of those lives. So life course then, that concept forces certain defining questions to be asked of analyses focusing on place and disadvantage. So these are the three conceptual pillars that I've found useful in my work, especially in their interaction and cross-questioning. And I do hope they'll serve you well in your work and inspire you too.
Thank you.
Sit down.
Well, thank you very much, Ruth, for that great overview, as well as some very specific insights on a number of those concepts that I think will be of huge benefit to the work of the Life Course Centre. So I'm now just going to open it out for questions. We've got lots of questions coming in, some of you coming in on the screen. So if you can, I'm sure if there's a raise hand function here, is there? Yeah, so you can put your hand up. Or you can pop something into the chat as per the usual. Are there any questions coming in the room here?
I've got a quick one, if I may. Just waiting, and it'd be great to hear from the community out there some questions. We wanted to unsettle in this workshop some of these constructs, and you've done a good job on that. Right. Thank you. Just coming back to ethics, ultimately judgment. Some of the spatial formations we look at today, I mean, if you think about positivism, it was just saying we could retreat from judgment, we just rely on measurement and mapping, and it would tell us how things work, reflect back to us. Won't rehearse the critique of that, but where we went to after that, post-positivism, to say we can never refuse ethics and judgment, right? And we've got some difficult judgments ahead of us, I think, in this. I mean, if you look at it with increasing pluralisation and complexity and fluidity, I mean, some people have seen the film Nomadland, perhaps, and there's ambivalence in some of these new spatial, marginal, precarious formations. You know, sometimes people are expressing a will to depart from all this, right, in those places. The other example I give you is I did a lot of work on gated communities, you may remember, some years ago, and there's an argument that they're locationally disadvantaged, particularly as the population's age. They've designed out public services and they actually need those public services, public transport, public health. So what sort of judgment do we make about that? Do we study that? You know, so I wonder if you had any further reflections around that idea of the necessity of judgment.
Well, there is a necessity of judgment because you have to make judgments before you act in any way. So not just in government settings, but if you're in a community group or if you're an individual scholar, in order to act, you have to exercise judgment, whether that's what you mean by a judgment and so on. So I think we have to find ourselves in that position. But I think one of the things that comes out of the kinds of concepts we're dealing with here is that there are a range of judgments that could be made, and there's a complex pattern of advantaging and disadvantaging going on in most of the actual situations you might observe in places. So yeah, I think there's no question but that judgments have always to be made. And the task of researchers, I think, is really to try and get the best possible, as I say, the best possible correspondence between the way the world is in its complexity and what is reflected in our knowledge frameworks so that we can make those judgments in the most informed way. And one of the downsides for the judgment making process of the kind of discussion I've given is that it is all about demonstrating the complexity and knowing the groundedness of situations as closely as one can. It makes the judging process perhaps more difficult in many situations. Yeah. So
I'm going to ask a question, and I'm also, just by way of warning for our Indigenous participants, because I'm going to ask something about Indigenous knowledge and places, and anyone who's online or folks in the room might or might not want to chip in. I'm not, so feel free not to say anything here, but in your discussion of place, Ruth, you talked about a sense of place as one of those. Sense of place for me, a lot of, I'm thinking of George Seddon's work, who was a scholar from Western Australia, and others who write about sense of place almost as an environmental history, or almost as a very physical sense of place. And in your discussion of place, you mentioned that a couple of times, but it was still very much a social kind of construct of, this is how we measure people, or we put them in a container, or this is the relationships between people in place, without much mention of the actual physical place. And that also then led me to think about Indigenous ideas of country. And so from other Indigenous participants, I don't know if you had any reflections on, we've been talking about place, or Ruth and this whole centre is talking about place. Are we missing something by not talking about country? Are there Indigenous knowledges and ways of knowing that might actually help to contribute to some of these discussions? So maybe if you want to talk a bit more about that.
I mean, I'd be delighted for other people to add in there. I think that's a really important thought, Sarah. And I mean, you really can't, I mean, I'm no expert on the concept of country, so I wouldn't have, put it in my paper, but I think it really would be wonderful to incorporate that in a thorough understanding of, the whole additional knowledge that we can gain about place from that deep perspective. And I mean, I mentioned infrastructure, but in no sense could you consider it under that heading. So I think, yes, the environmental history, and not just the sort of environment, the non-human history, but the human, non-human relationship history of locations, and the extent of what constitutes a place out of those understandings would be really a wonderful thing to include in the Life Course Centre's work. And I mean, that might come out a lot in your next session, Brendan, perhaps.
I was going to, and glad that you mentioned that, because I was going to make a comment around talking about place and the now, place and the time. And in my people's language, they both mean the same.
Yes.
So our word for here is gimmer, and our word for now is gimmer. So here and the now.
Yeah, so the space-time is completely the same. Yeah.
Has the same word, two different meanings, but they intertwine. And you've actually prompted me to thinking about, realising about the past and the present and the future. And for us, First Nations people, it's all one. We live in the past, we live in the now, and that's what we term dreaming. It's a European word, dreaming. In language, it's telekata, means all the time and back and now. But it had me thinking what you were saying about living in today's society. There is and we just had Anzac Day, there's a strong emphasis on the past history, and there's a potential, the thinking about the potential future plannings. But the here and the now seems to be missing, albeit we're living in the here and the now, but there seems to be more of an emphasis on the history and the future. I'm just wondering if you've heard any is about that.
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, I think in conceptions of place in the, you know, the limited way that I discussed, there certainly is recognition that the past, as I'll describe it, of a place is there in the way that, as Sarah says, a sense of place is understood. I mean, that's certainly, you know, so even in that little example I had of that activist anti-gentrification group in Baltimore, I mean, there was a long-standing sense in their terms, not yours, in their terms of this as a low-income neighbourhood that had always had low-income people living in it, and now they were the particular group of low-income. So that they were wanting the future and the present to remember that past. So in that sense, I think there is often even in this limited idea of sense of places I've presented, there is a recognition that in the present and the future, you certainly don't escape the past, and they are, as you sort of more eloquently say, Brendan, they are the same thing. So I don't know. I mean, I'm interested in it may be that some of the thinkers you were thinking about it at Anzac Day didn't see the future as including the past, which I agree with you is to be avoided, to take that position. Yeah.
Okay, well, I think, sorry, it's a very subtle hand up over here. And can I just remind you that this is the speaker is here, so if you can speak up.
Louder. Yeah, thank you, Ruth. My question is, what does it do to name a person or a place disadvantaged? Is that ever helpful?
Yeah.
I know I'm guilty of doing that.
Yeah.
Many times. So.
Yeah. Oh.
Sorry, can you just repeat the question?
So the question was, what does it do to call someone or a place disadvantaged?
Yeah. A huge ethical issue. One of the ones that we can be clear about. I think, there's a whole body of work about place stigma. And I remember, certain country towns in Victoria have really, where some dreadful thing might have happened, have really suffered from then always being named as the place where that happened. So I think, yes, the disadvantaging word could do that, couldn't it? It could have that effect if it's repeatedly. So I guess that then brings you to the work of people like Catherine Gibson and so on, who've really tried to emphasise the point that in any community there are strengths and achievements and characteristics that really need to be highlighted that are very positive. And she, work on community economies, as you know, has always worked with that and away from the term disadvantage as a label. And that's a really good point, Ilan. I should have stuck that in. In part, the emphasis that things like the World Social Science Report on Inequality, call for about a flip to equality is getting a bit at that point, that it's important to document the ways that resilient responses and forms of equality making are present even in the most otherwise difficult of circumstances. So, yeah.
Okay, and I would like to once again thanks Ruth.
Yeah.
And yes, we have a token of thank you for your great presentation coming from Brendan.
All right, thank you.
From all of us. Yeah.
Oh,
Yeah.
yes.
Thank you.
Good to see you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you
That's
for
very
that
kind.
presentation.